Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It is time again to take some of your questions, and they're all coming from Patreon this week. The first one is from Ivalera, who asks, she notices that on my Twitter I update when the Prime Minister will be at question period, and he only tends to come twice a week. Do you think that's a problem, or is it okay since he answers all the questions on one of those days? And then goes on to say, I realize that QP is kind of useless, especially these days, but do you think you should go there for more than, or go more just for optics, and is thinking about Ignatieff's situation, for instance, when he got into trouble for this. So I think what she's referring to Ignatieff is with the faux controversy around his attendance. And what that was had to do with, because they don't have public attendance records in the House of Commons, the NDP Brain Trust decided to take his voting record and how many he missed. The problem there was that Ignatieff made a habit of not voting on private members' bills in order to essentially give his caucus a free hand so that they weren't going to look to him for direction for how he would vote on that. And the NDP then spun this falsely as poor attendance. So I think that's what she's getting to there. In terms of the broader question of only 2 days a week, he used to generally do 3 days a week. It's now down to two. And the fact that he's been doing these kind of quasi prime minister's questions on Wednesdays, I don't think necessarily makes up for that, in part because it's a little bit performative. The Liberals like to put on a big show and pat themselves on the back for how many questions he's answered over the time period. But we have to remember that a lot of these responses are not really answers. When you've got one person who can only brief so much, trying to answer every question over the course of a day, a day, 45 minutes for question period, who doesn't necessarily have all the materials on that and has only got a binder with so many responses in it, it sometimes just turns into an exercise of Trudeau responding to questions with pat talking points and, usual platitudes and back patting. And that's why I think there's limited utility in the notion of him answering all the questions 1 day a week. He liked to make it a big kind of song and dance about how he'll answer anyone's question that day, but we have speaking lists in this country, so it's not like anyone can get up and ask a question on those days. And it's kind of been gamed by the opposition in certain ways as well, because they will try and ask things that they know he doesn't have a proper answer, or he couldn't possibly have a proper answer for, or something like that, and they'll try and put on a big show about it. Aaron O'Toole has recently decided to use this to his own advantage, where he will follow up on one of his other MP's questions and then ask one of his own, so that he's accumulating a library of media clips where he looks like he's asking tough questions on all manner of subject matter rather than just whatever the topic du jour is in the leaders round. So they're kind of using tactically both ways. This is one of those kind of areas where the differences between how question period in Canada and Prime Minister's questions in the UK also really varies. In the UK, the Prime Minister is only there 1 day a week, and it's something where they submit questions ahead of time so that the Prime Minister can become sufficiently briefed in order to have a proper response to it. And it's a much more high pressure situation for the Prime Minister in that case. This one is not really quite so much, because we don't have a tradition of asking questions or submitting the questions in advance in order to get a substantive answer, barring an occasional circumstance where a critic will do that, either out of a sense of fair play, which occasionally MPs have, or because they know it's something that requires a very specific answer and want to be able to get it in a public setting like that. My other only comment on that is basically, I think it's important that the Prime Minister attend more than once or twice a week, is because Parliament is all about holding government to account, and having the Prime Minister as the focus for that accountability is important in our system. And one of the advantages of the way Canadians do question period is that we're able to be much more responsive to the news of the day. In the UK, where you've got days allocated to certain ministers and the Prime Minister on one day a week, there is less of an ability to react to emerging situations or news of the day. And so I think that's where our question period has a bit of an advantage. Unfortunately, question period being what it is, that's of limited utility, just in the way that we've been kind of using it the last decade or so. But I think that utility is important, and it's something we should kind of keep in mind as we kind of go forward and evaluate what the record has been in terms of Trudeau trying to make this Wednesday PMQ thing part of his legacy. Our next question is from Martin, who asks, how does public health emergency legislation vary across Canadian provinces? Are there some that give more authority and deference and independence to chief medical officers of health than others? And notes that at least one pundit in Newfoundland thinks that their government let the CMO run the show in the spring. And okay, so short answer is, not being a lawyer, I don't know that I have enough expertise to read through all of them and find out what the minute differences between them are. I'm just going to speak more to broad principles of how governance works in Canada, and that is that it's cabinet that makes decisions, and it's cabinet that's responsible for them. Chief medical officers of health have some limited emergency powers in terms of, being able to close a school or a restaurant or a swimming pool or something like that. But that's of less utility in something like, our current situation, because it's a much more broad-based impact on society, and giving the chief medical officers the ability to make regulation or enforcement without any kind of political oversight is bad for our system and bad for accountability, because we, the public, can't hold that chief medical officer to account. We can only hold the cabinet, premier and cabinet to account. So that's kind of how the structure works, and I think it's important to remember that. If in Newfoundland, for example, the government simply deferred to the judgment of the chief medical officer there, then that is the government's choice, that's the government's decision, that's the government who gets to be held to account for that. But there's nothing really legislative that would force a government to defer to that person in one way or another. And that's for the best, really, because, again, that's how accountability works in our system. And this is one of these things that we've seen a lot of over the course of this pandemic, is a lot of focus being placed on these chief medical officers and the advice they're giving. And people want more transparency in what the advice is so that we know what cabinet's decisions are. I think that sometimes is giving too much deference to the advice itself and not to what decisions cabinet's making. And I think people are trying to blame the medical officers for advice when it's, and we've seen this come out in several provinces now where there's been either leaks or General's reports or whatnot where Cabinet has not been following that advice. And we should always assume that it's Cabinet making the advice, regardless of who the Chief Medical Officer is or what their advice is. And I think that's one of the things we need to remember over the course of what's going to unfold in the next few months, as things start to wind down with this pandemic, as vaccines roll out and so on, is just to remember that decisions were made by cabinets, by premiers and cabinets, not by chief medical officers of health, regardless of what their advice was. And so that's where we just need to keep that focus. And Martin also had one other question, which was, do I keep track of who I give style awards and citations to on my QP recaps? Are there league leaders and repeat offenders? Do you try to spread the awards around, or is it really a matter of who catches your eye every day? And for the recent ones, do you consider only those present in the house in person? So yes, in the current hybrid situation, I'm only looking at the people who are in the chamber at the time. It's a lot of who catches my eye over the course of the day. I always make sure that I've got gender balance, so there's always one best and worst dressed male MP and female MP. But you will get a dishonorable mention if you wear yellow and black, regardless of who you are. I also just try and spread it around a little bit so it's not the same person every day. So if certain MPs are particularly good or bad dressers, I'm trying not to only give them one snap or citation a week, so that it spreads it around a little more. And it's, that's pretty much as much as my thought process goes into it. The rest is just who catches my eye that day, and some days are easier than others in terms of trying to decide who I think is the best and worst dressed. And some days it's really tough because there's either a lot of really bad dressers or just an absence of anyone who kind of stands out in terms of, is looking particularly good for the day. League leaders, I would say probably, the Prime Minister knows how to wear a well-tailored suit, and so he's generally up there. Michelle Rempel-Garner has been a breath of fresh air in terms of ability to wear, outfits that are stylish and that understand her body shape and who look good and so on. Those are things that are important that I look for. And I would also say, I'm just trying to think in terms of league leaders in other respects. There was a time back when this was on a different blog, many years ago when it was first getting started, when NDP MP Megan Leslie was still new. I had a special outfit watch for her every day because some of them were particularly I'm going to say eye-catching in not necessarily a complimentary way. I think one that always is burned into my memory is a pumpkin orange wrap dress with bright teal tights. She, was someone who was from this mindset of, would get everything. A lot of her clothes were like vintage store finds, that kind of thing, and did not necessarily compliment her or really make her look professional. And that was kind of a point I was trying to get across at the time, was you're an MP, you're making $180,000 a year. I think it behoves someone to have a sense of professionalism in how they present themselves to the Canadian public. And some are very good at that, and some are not very good at that. I do try to be fair in terms of, I'm not trying to pick on hair or weight or anything like that, because that really isn't much of a consideration when you know how to dress for your body shape, your body type. These are lessons that can all be learned. And so I'm just, it started out as a bit of fun, as just kind of a way of engaging readers. And some of the MPs really got into it. I had situations where some would come and find me in the foyer afterwards and apologize for a particularly bad outfit. Doesn't happen as much anymore. I also heard stories that when we had a lot of really young MPs, if they got a particular snap that day, they'd kind of treat it as a trophy amongst themselves. So it's all kind of in good fun, but it was also just kind of a reflection of these are how our MPs are presenting themselves to the public. And yeah, I appreciate when people put some thought into it and who are not just, I guess, kind of phoning it in, which can be really easy when you're in that kind of a position and you've kind of developed a uniform for yourself. So that's kind of where that was. And anyway, yeah, just thanks for noticing and for reading along. I appreciate feedback on that kind of thing. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.